Hi everyone. In today's video, we are going to be tackling a heavier topic, and that is around the connection between mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, and mass shootings. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Living Well with Schizophrenia channel. If you're new here, my name is Lauren, and I make videos about what it's like to live with schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia. The odds are that due to the content discussed in this video, it will be demonetized by YouTube. So for this reason especially, we want to say a huge thank you to our supporters on Patreon who allow us to keep creating valuable and sometimes more controversial videos like this one. If you are interested in becoming a patron, you will also have access to our private Discord server. On this, you will have access to our online community providing peer support through text and voice and video groups. If this is something that interests you and you would like to support us continuing to make videos like this one, make sure to check out our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. So this video is primarily going to be discussing a recent study that was just published in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology titled Domestic Mass Shooters, the Association with Unmedicated and Untreated Psychiatric Illness. We will provide a link to the full journal article in the description. Basically, this study is claiming that the vast majority of individuals who commit mass shootings have a psychiatric illness, and the majority of which they claim have schizophrenia. Now, there may be some validity to this association, but there were many issues with this study that we will discuss in just a minute. I first want to point out the way the media has been picking up this story and using it to essentially perpetuate harmful and stigmatizing narratives towards people living with schizophrenia and mental illness. The study itself points out its limitations and even cautions against over-reliance on their study. This is a very problematic study, which we will get to in just a minute, which led to a very problematic and misleading bit of journalism. News article titles like "Many U.S. mass shooters had mental illness" are ungrounded and highly presumptive, leading to immense stigma for those who are living with mental illness. These reportings really just perpetuate the harmful narratives that exist around individuals living with mental illness being dangers to society. All right, so let's get into the actual study that was done. First of all, this was a retrospective naturalistic observational study. This basically means that it was simply looking back on limited data on past events. It also had an incredibly small sample size. Of 115 cases, they selected 35 and also had no control group to compare it with. Basically, they only looked at the 35 cases where the individual who committed the mass shooting survived and for which legal proceedings were instituted. In the majority of mass shootings, the assailant either dies by suicide or is killed by police. Where possible, for each of these shooting cases where the shooter survived, they interviewed forensic psychiatrists and forensic psychologists who examined the perpetrator after the crime and/or collected the testimony and reports by psychiatrists in the court record. They also reviewed available information from the court proceedings, public records, videotaped interviews, social media postings, and writings if these were available. The interviewing psychiatrist involved in this study made a retrospective psychiatric diagnosis for 28 of the 35 cases, or 80%. They also decided that 18 had schizophrenia, or 56%, 3 had bipolar 1, 2 had delusional disorders, persecutory type, 2 had personality disorders, 2 had substance-related disorders, and 1 had post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's a pretty obvious bias here in terms of the potential differences between those who survived their mass shooting and those who did not. Perhaps assailants who had a mental illness were more likely to survive than those who did not, which would lead to why there was such a high amount of people who had a psychiatric illness in that 35. So, in an effort to address this bias, they selected a measly 20 additional cases at random where the assailant had died. From these 20, they studied 15 who they thought there was enough information to make a diagnosis for. They determined 8 of these 15 had schizophrenia, or 53%. However, their only basis for this diagnosis was on media reportings of the incident, instead of the far more thorough forensic analysis they used with the shooters who survived. Notice any gaping holes with the strategy of using news narratives of a mass shooting to make a diagnosis? So, this study was very limited by its retrospective nature, by its incredibly small and questionably selected sample size, and by the questionable process of diagnosing the perpetrators with no actual ability to interview them directly. However, we found even more issues with this study too. First of all, the researchers had their own inherent biases, which would have been very difficult to circumvent given the methods of this study. The idea for this study originated from the principal investigators, or the lead author's idea that most mass shooters were people with unidentified psychiatric illness. The authors even admit how limited this study is and caution against over-reliance on the findings of our study. Not to mention the fact that the researchers explicitly diagnosed these assailants based on the DSM-5, when the DSM-5 includes an explicit cautionary statement for forensic use of the diagnostic criteria found in it. It also strikes me as odd that most of the surviving assailants diagnosed in this study with schizophrenia had not been priorly diagnosed, and none had received any treatment, and yet 40% of the cases studied were people over 40 years old at the time of their mass shooting. It's somewhat hard to believe that that many people could have made it to 40 years old without being diagnosed at all, given that the typical age of onset is in the teen years to the 20s. I know that I definitely could not have made it that long without ending up in the hospital or homeless and then likely in jail. Now, we're going to take a closer look at the database the researchers pulled their data from. It is likely the most comprehensive available database on mass shootings in the United States. The dataset covers mass shootings that took place from 1982 to 2021. However, the study looks at cases until 2019. It is important to note that the list does not include robbery or gang-related mass shootings. If these were included, the association of psychiatric illness to mass shootings would likely drastically decrease. This dataset is publicly available, and if you would like to take a look, we will link to it in the description. We decided to review the data, and we estimated that roughly 30% of the shootings involved a grudge or were hate-fueled crimes, which we will explain in more detail in a bit. 11% were likely related to psychosis, and 59% we felt we didn't have enough information to make a judgment about. So we defined grudge-related offenses to be the majority of workplace incidents whereby language used to describe the shooting included keywords such as revenge, disgruntled, work dispute, argument, fired, disciplinary issues, work conflict, salary dispute, or laid off. We also included relationship issues, which included keywords such as bitter divorce, custody battle, argument, domestic abuse, recent breakup, or altercation. Hate-fueled crimes we saw as racist-motivated incidents involving keywords such as Asian descent, anti-Semitism, racist, hate crime, racially motivated, Islamic extremism, terrorism, black church, or Sikh Gurdwaras. We also included incidents involving sexism with keywords such as misconduct against females. We also included incidents involving homophobia, including a gay nightclub. Incidents involving authority with keywords of cop killer or targeted police. Ideological incidents, including language involving Planned Parenthood. This overarching category of grudge or hate-fueled crimes is likely even underrepresented in our estimations. In the 11% we deemed as likely to involve psychosis, we looked for language including delusional, mind control, incoherent, nonsensical, heard voices, conspiring against, paranoia, and conspiracies. We also included incidents where the individual had personally sought help or had a previous diagnosis of schizophrenia. We also considered the nature of the shooting, whether it was random or persecutory. This category is also likely underrepresented in our estimations because we did veer on the more conservative side when attributing it to psychosis. So based on our own analysis, we believe there are better predictors of mass shootings than psychiatric diagnoses. We found that 96% of the mass shooters were male. We found that 54% of the mass shooters were white. 14% of the mass shooters had military experience. 68% of the mass shooters had legally obtained the gun they used. And this may seem obvious given we're discussing mass shootings, but 100% of these mass murders were committed using guns. Access to guns and gun violence just might be a part of this issue. Also, to put this into perspective, between 1982 and 2021, 996 people died in mass shootings in the United States, according to the database. However, in 2018 alone, which is the most recent year for which data is available, 38,390 people died by guns in the United States. Gun violence is out of control and is absolutely a gigantic part of the problem. The reality is that this type of violence and mass shooters are a product of our culture and society. I don't think it's a coincidence that sex and race and access to guns were such huge predictors of mass shootings, or the inherent component of alienation from societal groups. I think there is also an important component to also consider that yes, mental illness can play a role in this type of violent crime. Society needs to do a better job of supporting people with psychosis spectrum illnesses. None of these assailants given a diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder in the study had received any form of treatment. Perhaps there is a greater message here in the importance of reducing stigma, which this study certainly does not do, and increasing public education. Increased stigma will likely only serve to increase the number of psychosis-related mass shootings due to further public alienation or disillusionment and decreased access to treatment and supports. All right, so we were fairly critical of this study, but I think it's also important to acknowledge our own biases in this. I am a person who lives with schizoaffective disorder, which is a schizophrenia spectrum illness. And so I don't very much like when there are, headings of news articles and whatnot that are attributing mass shootings to, people with psychiatric diagnoses such as schizophrenia. So we did come at this from a critical perspective. And so we are going to be reaching out to the principal investigator or the lead author of this study to see if he has any comments about some of the criticisms we've presented in this video, and to see if he has really kind of any defense for essentially the weaknesses of this study. If he does reply with any sort of statement, we will be sure to include that in the description of this video. Now, also, we haven't tackled the topic of violence and schizophrenia yet because it is a very difficult to navigate and nuanced topic of discussion. Schizophrenia is a chronic illness, and when someone is in the midst of psychosis, it is possible for them to commit a violent act. And that is just kind of the reality of the nature of psychosis, especially when gone untreated. And so I think that, it is important to explore what can be done to mitigate this within society and how we can better support these individuals who may be experiencing psychosis and how to potentially avoid these violent crimes from happening. However, I think that because it is such a nuanced and difficult to navigate topic, it is extremely important to conduct very responsible and, well done research around this. This study itself said that it should not be over relied upon. So why was it published? If it's just going to perpetuate harmful narratives within society and it's not done as, valid scientific research, then why is it being put out there? And so I think that we have a responsibility to look into the issue of violence and schizophrenia on a deeper level, but to do it as responsibly as possible and in a way that does not perpetuate negative stigma in society. Also, I just want to reiterate the fact that hopefully, throughout our video, we've demonstrated that it is not just psychiatric illness that leads to gun violence or mass shootings. There are a multitude of different societal and cultural factors at play too that are probably better predictors of whether someone will be a mass shooter or not. All right, so thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you would like to support the creation of future videos like this one, please make sure to check out our Patreon page. And also, if you want to keep seeing content from us, make sure to subscribe. Thank you so much again for watching, and as always, wishing you and your loved ones good health. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.